Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another. Let me start that over. Hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History podcast. Tonight we're going to be covering a bit of ground here. We're going to be talking first about the Gospel of the Hebrews. Then, in the second half of the show, we're going to talk about the Clementine recognitions. Actually, the second topic of tonight may end up being most of the show. But without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to share screens. I don't like uploading PowerPoint presentations to StreamYard, as I've said in the past, because that stuff, well, can get, like, it won't appear correctly on the screen. Sometimes the text will go off the screen. Whatever. The two Gospels of Matthew. I've got an image of Matthew laughing here while he's writing. Two different versions of Matthew. I think that Matthew if you wanted to call him Matthew the evangelist, or he's kind of like an evangelist, he's writing in the early 2nd century, and he's writing the Greek Gospel of Matthew. For many years, as I believe many of you know, I believe, and still do, the four Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, are all 2nd century texts, early 2nd century texts, all of them written within the first 35 years of the 2nd century, so between 100 to 135 AD. With John being last, and I put John right on AD 135. But anyway, I changed my mind. Yes, I know I'm not on the screen. That's because I'm on full screen mode on the PowerPoint. I changed my mind on the Gospel of the Hebrews. Oh, by the way, I will appear on screen again in a little bit, but for now, back to the PowerPoint presentation. So anyway, the Gospel of the Hebrews is a very difficult subject to tackle because you have some who believe that the text came first before the four Gospels. But with me, even though I wasn't really specific about this in the past, it was kind of mixed bagged with me. I thought that there was something, a Hebrew Matthew source that was written before Mark. At least that's what I used to think. Hold on, someone's saying that my PowerPoint isn't showing. Is anyone having this problem? Because Riley is saying that the PowerPoint isn't showing, but I know it's on the screen. I'm just showing the title, the first image of the PowerPoint, okay? That's where it's at right now. I checked the stream. It's on there, so I don't know what's going on, Riley. Maybe your YouTube app is having an issue. Yes, right now it's just a cover. It's just a cover. It's supposed to be that. I see the confusion. It's supposed to be like that right now. I'll be going to the next slide in a second. It's just a title slide. I'm trying to explain the situation, okay? I'm just trying to explain the situation before I show everything else. Anyway, I'm not going to keep re-explaining that. I'll get to the next slide in a second. Let me finish with this. Anyway, I do think, given the church father obsession over Matthew the apostle writing something, I suspect that there was a Hebrew text by Matthew in the late AD 30s that existed. But I've come to realize the church fathers never quote it. And that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about something entirely different. And it was not written by Matthew the apostle. It was written by a far later different person with the same name, living in the early 2nd century. It all culminates with Papias. You could refer to Papias as the Big Bang of church father literature. But there's a problem. There's a catch. Papias, often hailed as the best evidence for the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew being a first century text, simultaneously is the worst evidence for it. Papias is actually used by scholars to defend Markan priority. Let's take a look at why they believe that Papias supports Markan priority, and it has to do with fragment 6 of what Papias wrote, or at least the fragments from what Papias wrote, what remains of what Papias wrote, because most of his work is lost. Like 99.9% of his work is lost. What's left is small fragments, such as the one on the screen here. Let's read. I'm going to read the teal, and I'm going to read the teal first, then the yellow next. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. Matthew put together the oracle of the Lord in Hebrew. Oracles of the Lord. Let me start over that. Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. There's a problem. He mentions Matthew after he mentions Mark. Keep in mind, it's the same text as used by Markan priorist, which is the consensus position. Mark is the first of the 4 Gospels. To show that Papias was aware that Matthew redacted Mark, Matthew used Mark to fix his order. I'll show a couple of scholarly examples of that in a second. Now let's read the whole thing. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took especial care not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. This is what is related by Papias regarding Mark, but with regard to Matthew, he has made the following statements. That's Eusebius writing his little comment there. Let's continue. Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. Eusebius goes on to say, after he's finished quoting Papias there, the same person uses proofs from the first epistle of John and from the epistle of Peter in like manner. And he also gives another story of a woman who was accused of many sins before the Lord, which is to be found. I don't know why it says font there. I should say found. Let me fix that. That's bothering me. Let me fix that. I don't know if somebody misspelled that before I put it in the presentation, because I'm using a translation. I don't know what's going on there, but anyway, I should say found. Anyway, it's fixed now. Okay. Which is to be found in the gospel according to the Hebrews. Someone says, it sounds like to me it could just be a list of Old Testament quotes they related to Jesus that the evangelists used. Stephen Carlson suggested something like that. I disagree, because it doesn't say that here. It just doesn't say it. It's not saying that these are prophecies from the Old Testament being put into this text. Besides, the Hebrew gospel is quoted by church fathers later. It's the same one they're talking about in Papias. Matthew used Mark, and I think Papias couldn't be more specific there. Matthew used Mark. Hebrew Matthew used Mark. Mark is its source. Regardless of what we may think of Hebrew Matthew or what we think it's its content, Matthew used Mark. So that's the situation there. And notice that it says that the woman caught up in adultery is in the Gospel of the Hebrews, according to Eusebius in his comment on Papias. That means it was there earlier than the Gospel of John, before it was inserted into the Gospel of John. Now, y'all know how I feel about hypothetical additions. I don't like hypothetical sources, hypothetical redaction. I don't accept any of that stuff. But the Gospel of John, missing the woman caught up in adultery, has been proven by manuscript evidence. It was added later. That actually was added later. And the origin of it seems to be the Gospel of the Hebrews. So they copied that and inserted it into John hundreds of years later. Let me suggest here what I think is going on. I agree with Dr. Samuel Zinner in his argument that the person that wrote the Gospel of Hebrew Matthew is the same person that wrote the Greek Gospel of Matthew. Let me explain very clearly, because I know someone's going to misinterpret what I said and say, I believe the Greek text is a translation of the Hebrew Gospel. When people that know Greek really, really well have shown that it is not it's not translation Greek. I agree with them. It's not translation Greek. Why do you think I have Matthew laughing when he's writing two Gospels of Matthew? Because he's not writing the same text. He's just like Paul in a sense from the epistles. Even ironically, even though Matthew's anti-Pauline in many ways, but he imitates Paul in one form, in a sense. He mimics Paul. What he says in his letters, I am all things to all men. To those I'm under the law, I'm under the law. To those that are not under the law, I'm not under the law. In other words, he's a chameleon. He's telling one thing to one group of people, telling the exact opposite, a contradictory thing to another. He's not writing the same text. That's why it's not a translation. This is something else. He's deliberately presenting contradictory information to different audiences. I'll give one major example because I don't have time to go through all the major examples tonight. In the Hebrew Gospel, Matthew says, Matthew the Gospel author, not Matthew the Apostle, Matthew the Gospel author says that Jesus was possessed by the Christ at the baptism. There's no virgin birth in it at all. In Greek, Matthew, totally different text, which is not a translation of of the other text he wrote, just a totally different text. Same author. He creates the virgin birth story. This contradicts what he wrote in the Hebrew Gospel completely. The Christ possessed Jesus. When the church fathers quote the Hebrew Gospel, that's clear. The Christ possessed Jesus. Jesus was a biological son of Joseph and Mary. There is no mention of virgin birth. Matthew was lying. Matthew told a Hebraic audience one thing, told the Greek audience another. I think one can come to a reasonable guess as to why he didn't tell the Hebrews that. The Hebrews would have said, this is pagan. We don't believe in this kind of stuff. Right. It's Greco-Roman virgin birth stories, Greco-Roman imitation in the Greek version. The Greek take on the Gospel of Matthew, because it's two different takes. He did one in Hebrew, he did one in Greek. And one is not a translation of the other. It's not. Yet, same author. Are all of you following me on this? You understand what I'm saying? I'm going to wait for some responses in the chat before I continue. Okay, good. I'm glad I'm making sense tonight. We're going to go through one scholarly example. This is from more than 100 years ago. Then we're going to go to a more modern example from last year. Envy Expositor by Robertson Nicole W. Robertson. I said it backwards. Hodder and Stoughton. If I'm saying that right. This is what they had to say. Mark then Matthew, in the former he mentions ton kuriakon, logion, and the latter ta logia. This rather favors the view that Eusebius places the extracts in the order in which he found them in Papias, i.e., Mark before Matthew, and that Papias first uses the title, the oracles or words of the Lord, in then repeats it in an abbreviated form as the oracle's Irenaeus preface has dialogia Kyria, can the omission of the article to denote that he includes Old Testament, and Kyriakon, Logion, and Dialogia to Pheu, followed by instances taken from the Gospels, St. Paul's epistles in the Old Testament, the phrase Scriptura Dominica, or Kyriakai Graphe, is used presumably about the whole New Testament by Irenaeus and Dionysius of Corinth. Okay, let's go to the next example. So this scholar clearly understands Papias, as I do, fully supporting Markan priority. Let's take a look at the Apostolic Fathers, Volume 4, Ancient Literature for New Testament Studies. And this is what one of the scholars in there has to say about Papias. Having seen the surviving fragments of Papias and Irenaeus and Eusebius, it is appropriate to pay closer attention to what he says about Mark and Matthew. Papias delivers his statements about the two gospel writers as from the elder or presbyter, not as simply what he remembered that he had heard. This report from the elder extends through what he reports about Mark and what he says about Matthew if what Papias reports is correct, and he can be trusted here to report what he heard from the elder. Then there are important implications for studies in the Synoptic Gospels. The clear implication is that Matthew wrote his gospel partly to correct what he perceived as Mark's lack of order. See that? To correct what he perceived as Mark's lack of order. I agree. That's what it sounds like to me. Mark in priority. Let me put myself back on the screen before I shift the topic to the Clementine recognitions. So, I think that the likely author of this text was Bishop Matthias of Jerusalem. He was a bishop in the AD 120s. And I think he's the one, at least that's my best guess, that he's the one that had the authority, he had the resources, he was a bishop. I think he used Mark as a source. I think he knew Hebrew, he knew Greek, and he decided to write two different versions of Matthew. He wrote one in Hebrew, he wrote one in Greek. Somebody asked me if I have a candidate for the author of Mark. I think Mark was an early 2nd century Christian. As y'all can tell, I don't reject the hagiographical attributions of the Gospels. I just think they were just names of Christians in the early 2nd century. Saying that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John wrote those texts is not accepting that they're 1st century. It's not accepting that they're eyewitnesses. It's not the same thing. One can believe people with those names wrote those Gospels without believing that they are eyewitness testimony. I think a lot of people don't understand that. Rejecting that they are anonymous documents is not the same thing as accepting the theological claims that are connected to them, that are tied with them. I don't have a problem accepting those names. Mark was just somebody living in the early 2nd century. So what? Same thing with Matthew. Mark and Matthew don't even claim to be eyewitnesses. Same with Luke. Only John claims to be an eyewitness. And, well, John's lying, obviously. He was not an eyewitness. He's just claiming that. Do we have the full Hebrew gospel of Matthew? No, we don't. The original, the real Hebrew logia of Matthew, if you want to call it that, long gone. Nobody quotes it. We have nothing. We have literally nothing from it. I think it existed, but it's gone completely. All we have is the what's being called the Gospel of the Hebrews or Hebrew Matthew is a later text from the early 2nd century written by a different person with the same name, basically. That's it. The only connection to them is they happen to have the same name. Nobody's quoting the earlier document. It's gone. Completely gone. There's no way of telling what's in it. It's impossible right now. We may never know what's in it. It is just gone. Have to accept that. Completely gone. Let's see. Yeah, I think I answered that question about the candidate for the author of Mark. I think he was just an early 2nd century guy called Mark, like I said earlier. Exit Music says Luke claims to have compiled sources. Yeah. Yeah, he did. That's what he says. He knows Matthew, Mark. I have no doubt Luke knew both versions of Matthew. He knew the Hebrew and Greek one. I don't see why not. Luke knew Josephus. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, everybody in the New Testament knew Josephus. Even Paul's letters know Josephus. I think they're all utilizing Josephus's writings. I don't have a problem with that. And I think Luke had many sources, like he said. 791 asked me the question, do you like the theory John used of free synoptics? I've never believed that John's independent of the synoptics. I never bought into that. The consensus of scholars is shifting to accepting that John knew Matthew, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Totally on board. Completely. That stuff about the science gospel, it being written in multiple different stages, there's no proof. There's no proof for any of that. I know that there are some scholars out there that still hold on to that, and that's fine. That's cool, but I disagree. I think John wanted to do a reboot, if you want to put it that way, of the gospel story. He didn't like Mark, Matthew, and Luke. He wanted to put a new spin. John and Papias. Yeah, yes, Papias was involved in writing the Gospel of John. It's in the anti-Marcionite prologue of John. There are scholars that will question the history of that, like the validity of that story. I don't have a problem with it because by saying that Papias wrote it, well, you're kind of letting the cat out of the bag, right? You just said it's fake. They're lying about it going back to the beloved disciple. That's it. I mean, it's a weird thing to think that somebody just made up that Papias wrote John for John, as if John was old and he couldn't write. He needed help. That's what that's implying to me. It's heavily implying that he needed help to write it. He couldn't do it alone. That was AD 135. That's why I mentioned AD 135 as the end date for the composition of the canonical Gospels. So I don't think somebody made that up. I think that makes complete sense. When you read the Gospel of John, you can see passages about we did this, we did that. It's like co-authors writing it. You see the same thing in First John, by the way. Warren Carter talks about that in First John, that it looks like a committee of people wrote it because they said we this and we that. Warren does not believe the other things I mentioned earlier. I'm just noting that he also noticed the pluralism about the authors, co-authors of First John. So I agree, but that's because it was John and Papias. So yeah, like I said earlier, Hebrew Matthew, the real one, gone. I would say, in a sense, it's attested. It's attested in the sense that it's frequently confused with the Gospel of the Hebrews by the church fathers and with Papias' Hebrew Matthew. And I don't even know if it's a gospel. I doubt it was. It could have been a letter for all I know. It could have been a couple of paragraphs long. Who knows what was in there? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's gone. That's just the end of that. That's why I changed my mind. I changed my mind in making a direct connection between the two texts because Papias does not allow for that. It's clear in Papias. The Hebrew gospel, the one we have, postdates Mark, severing the connection between it and the original Hebrew Matthew, which is lost to history. X Music says, Jacob, I'm not up to date on where you stand with some any Josephus interpolations. If you're talking about the testimony of Flavianum and the James passage, it's the same position I've had for years. There was a couple of hiccups briefly, I admit that, but for the most part, entirely authentic on the testimonium and James passage, still my position today. I'm not convinced that they are interpolated. Let's go back to the presentation. Remember, I don't accept something as an interpolation without manuscript evidence. Let's move on now. Let's rethink the Clementine recognitions. A lot of you know by now, I rely heavily on the Clementine recognitions to show that the James that was attacked by Paul in AD 36 is not the same James the just, or I should say James the brother of Jesus, so-called brother of Jesus and Josephus, talked about by Josephus. Because does James die twice? That doesn't make any sense. He didn't get attacked twice 30 years apart. That's nonsense. I don't have the text on the screen right now. I'm not doing a whole show about James tonight. I mean, James is heavily involved, I admit that, in the topic. Dorotheus the Tyre quotes Abdias of Babylon. Abdias of Babylon in the 1st century AD. Dorotheus is in the 3rd century AD. I think he's 1st century AD. Anyway, about 3rd century AD, Dorotheus quotes Abdias of Babylon that after Paul left James for dead, just like you see in this text, someone found out that he was living and finished him off with a fuller's club and brained him. That was in 36 AD. The attack, this is the second attack, which happens very quickly after the first attack took place, in which Paul intended to kill James, but failed to get it done. Let's read the entire passage in the recognitions, and then we will discuss further. And when matters were at that point, that they should come and be baptized, some one of our enemies, that's Saul, because you can see at the beginning, tumult raised by Saul, entering the temple with a few men, began to cry out and to say, What mean ye, O men of Israel? Why are you so easily hurried on? Why are you led headlong by most miserable men, who are deceived by Simon a magician? While he was thus speaking and adding more to the same effect, and while James the bishop was refuting him, he began to excite the people and to raise a tumult, so that the people might not be able to hear what was said. Therefore, he began to drive all into confusion with shouting and to undo what had been arranged with much labor, and at the same time to reproach the priests and to enrage them with revelings and abuse, and like a madman, to excite everyone to murder, saying, What are you doing? Why do you hesitate? O sluggish and inert, why do we not lay hands upon them and pull all these fellows to pieces? When he had said this, he first seizing a strong brand from the altar, set the example of smiting. And others also seeing him, were carried away, with like readiness. Then ensued a tumult on either side of the beating and the beaten. Much blood is shed. There is a confused flight, in the midst of which that enemy attacked James and threw him headlong at the top of the steps, and supposing him to be dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. We're informed in a margin note of the Clementine recognitions that Saul was originally named as the attacker. This was removed by Tyrannus Rufinus in the early 5th century AD. It's from him that we get the final form of the text. He removed Saul's name. So we know that in the original one, thanks to that margin note, that Saul was identified as the enemy, which in my opinion refutes the idea that the Simon Magus in the Clementine recognitions was somehow a renamed Paul. They were originally distinct characters, and they technically still are distinct characters, even though Saul's not named in the final text. Extra Music says, so scholars say the Clementine recognition is pseudepigrapha. Why should we regard it as having any valid historical information? That's because you don't know enough about Clementine scholarship. There are several scholars out there, and I'm going to be showing one example tonight, Jeffrey J. Butts, for instance, that says portions of it are history, and they go back hundreds of years for the final version. So yes, it may be pseudepigrapha in its form that we have it now. Well, it is pseudepigrapha from the 2nd century, mid-2nd century. I'll show that it's mid-2nd century later. There's a lot of bad arguments that have been made about the dating of this text. We're going to get into that later in the presentation. So, if Clement of Rome in the AD 90s, because he wrote First Clement in AD 96, AD 95, AD 96, that's the consensus dating of First Clement. I agree. I'm going to accord with that. I don't have a problem with it. If this did not go back to Clement of Rome, what does it go back to? Where Pseudo-Clement got that information. In Book 1, Chapter 72, so this is 2 chapters after he mentions the attack on James. This is what we're told about where he got that information. Well, therefore we abode in Jericho and gave ourselves to prayer and fasting. James the bishop sent for me and sent me here to Caesarea, saying that Zacchaeus had written to him from Caesarea. So 2 chapters after we are told about the attack, the author, calling himself Clement, wastes no time in telling us about epistles, correspondence. Notice that fasting is talked about there. I talked about in the Gospel of the Hebrews before, it claims that Jesus appeared to James after the resurrection. James was fasting and refused to eat and drink till he had saw the risen Christ. That's in the Gospel of the Hebrews. Zacchaeus, in his epistle, being quoted by Clement, or Pseudo-Clement, I should say, is telling us something very similar. The only thing that's missing here is there is no resurrection appearance from Jesus. In fact, it had nothing to do with the resurrection at all. Prayer and fasting is being used in a totally different context from what's being discussed about James in the Gospel of the Hebrews. This tells me that this story is the epistle of Zacchaeus is much more historical than the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is theologizing the situation, integrating the resurrection into the situation when the resurrection was not discussed. Fisher Tai says, I do not see the issue of Saul attacking James in the 30s and James being killed in 62 per Josephus. What am I missing? I was previously not going to show it, but you know what? Let's do it. Let me show you what the problem is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to incorporate another slide from a previous presentation. I'm going to show all of you Dorotheus of Tyre, or so-called pseudo Dorotheus of Tyre. I should note that it's being called pseudo. Anyway, this is what he said about the attack. It's a little hard to read, but I have it highlighted. This is from Dorotheus of Tyre, or what some call pseudo Dorotheus of Tyre, by Saul. Well, let me read from the beginning there. He was by the Jews set upon a pinnacle of the temple, and as Abdius writeth, by Saul afterwards called Paul, thrown down and having breath after his fall, one came with a fuller's club, knocked him upon the head, and brained him. This is shortly after James survived the attack in the Clementine recognitions. Abdias of Babylon is finishing the story. And James, the brother of Jesus, 1,000-page book by Professor Robert Eisman, Dr. Robert Eisman. Dr. Eisman never quotes Dorothea's satire anywhere in the entire book. It's as if he doesn't even know about this. I don't think he knew about this. This text is the biggest problem in trying to harmonize the account in the Clementine recognitions with Josephus. I accept that there was a James that was Jesus' brother. I clearly don't have a problem with that. I've never had a problem with that. I have a problem with saying that what the person Josephus is telling us about, even though I accept the James passage as entirely authentic, I don't question it. I question Josephus. I question him. I question if that really is James, brother of Jesus, even though he says that's him. How does the same guy die twice, 30 years apart? This is a 3rd century text quoting Abdias of Babylon from the 1st century. Just like the Clementine recognitions is mid-2nd century quoting a 1st century epistle of Zacchaeus. This happens a lot. Sometimes we have later text quoting earlier text that we lost. We've lost a lot of things, right? Sometimes this is how we get some things preserved, just like with Papias. We have portions of Papias being quoted by Eusebius in the 4th century, which those quotes obviously come from Papias in the early 2nd century. Well, Ifishatai says, why have I never heard of this? I'll respond. I say, I think it's just gone under the radar. That kind of happens sometimes. I don't know why. I really don't. It's a real text. You can go get it. You can download it for free from the internet. You don't have to pay a dime for it. I don't know. There are older texts. I think it's in the, forgive me if I'm mistaken, but it might be in the, was it the Epistle of the Apostles? I can't remember. It was Apostles something. I can't remember the text. But there's a list that claims that Abdias was one of the 70 mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. I just can't remember the exact text or what it's called, but there is. Let me see if I can find it because this is bothering me. I want to know. Let me find it. I know somebody does. Let me find it. Hold on. From what I can tell, I don't know. I can't find it. Completely can't find it. I know there's a text that identifies this Abdias as one of the 70, 72, whatever, of the Gospel of Luke. I just can't remember. It's okay, there it is. It's on the left right there. One of the 72 disciples was a bishop of supposedly Britannia. That I'm sure that's mythologizing, but whatever. It's when I put it together, I think the core of the character of Abdias, the historical person, is he's a 1st century writer. I think probably before 70 AD, could be in the late 30s AD. It could be immediately after Zacchaeus wrote that epistle, which is kind of where I lean towards. I'm not certain of that, but regardless, he's definitely finishing the story that the attack, like, they hunted him down. They found out he was alive. It was very quick. This makes it sound like it was immediately, not even like within seconds, not days. If you believe the recognitions, which kind of is implying that James was alive for at least several days, Caiaphas was sending men to go after them, by the way. And this is talked about. I'm not reading all that stuff. It's in book 1, and it's talked about, I think, in chapter 71 um, and 73, something like that. If we go back to chapter 72, it's kind of implying that they're still in danger if we keep reading it. Because let's see. That one Simon, a Samaritan magician, was subverting many of our people, asserting that he was one stans, that is, in other words, the Christ, and the great power of the high God, which is superior to the creator of the world. At the same time, that he showed many miracles and made some doubt, and others fall away to him. He informed me of all the things that had been ascertained respecting this man from those who had formerly been either his associates or his disciples, and had afterwards been converted to Zacchaeus. Many, therefore, there are, O Peter, said James, for whose safety's sake it behooves you to go and to refute the magician. So safety's brought up here. There's some kind of, like, the situation's not over. That's clear. And Caiaphas sends people after them. I'm not going to go through the passages where Caiaphas, the high priest, is doing this. And Paul was working for Caiaphas, by the way. The text is pretty clear about that. More on that another time, because the core argument I want to make tonight is that the recognitions is mid-2nd century. Okay, Jeffrey J. Butts, I mentioned him earlier. See my mouse? I'm going to start here because I'm not going to read all of this. There are 2 main parts, the homilies and the recognitions. These are both made up of yet smaller works, the Ascents of James, the Epistola Petra, and the Kerygmata Petro. The Ascents of James, which is part of the recognitions, takes its name from an incident where James ascends the steps of the temple to engage in a public debate over Jesus being the Messiah. Now I'm going to go earlier because I should have read this first. Anyway, the vast majority of scholars today consider the Pseudo-Clementines to be no earlier than the 4th century, at least in its final form. I mentioned that earlier. Well, it's really early 5th century because of Tranius Rufinus, but whatever. But a few such as Robert Eisenman, believe that the underlying traditions contained within it are much older. I mentioned that earlier too. This is supported by the fact that the Pseudo-Clementines is an anthology of smaller works. I just showed y'all an example. The Epistle of Zacchaeus. There are 2 main parts, the homilies and the recognitions. These are both made up of yet smaller works, the Ascents of James, the Epistola Petra, and the Kerygmata Petra. Okay, so we know the Clementine recognitions. I even gave an example earlier already. It's part of my argument. It's a collection of real history, real letters from the 1st century being mixed in with a bunch of historical fiction from the mid-2nd century, and it's further edited in the early 5th century. So yeah, that's a mouthful, but that's the situation. So yes, the Clementine recognitions may be late, but that's like saying Eusebius is late and he's quoting Papias, which makes what he says about Papias useless. That's not how this works. We have texts that use earlier text and cite them. Texts that we don't have, but they preserve when quoting them. Okay? That's my point. There was a 2nd Clement of Rome. Yes, there was. He wasn't bishop. But there is a 2nd Clement of Rome. It's in the Shepherd of Hermas. Thou shalt therefore write 2 little books, and shall send one to Clement and one to Grapti. So Clement shall send to the foreign cities, for this is his duty, while Grapti shall instruct the widows and the orphans. But those shall read the book to the city along with the elders that preside over the church. Okay. When did this Clement live? He's not a bishop, by the way. 2nd Clement was never a bishop of Rome. 1st Clement was. 2nd Clement was not. Yes, this is the same person that wrote the letter 2nd Clement, by the way. Let's pull up the next thing here. The Moratorian fragment. I'm not going to get into if the Moratorian fragment is 2nd or 4th century. That's under dispute. I'm not even going to bother giving my thoughts on when it dates. It doesn't really matter. My point here is that the Moratorian fragment gives us the information we need. But Hermas wrote the Shepherd very recently in our times in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the episcopal chair of the Church of the City of Rome. When did Bishop Pius I of Rome live? Well, part of his life, obviously. When was he bishop? AD 142 to 156. So that tells me that the recognitions came from that reign. A few years after the Gospel of John, around Marcion's time, because that's definitely Marcion's period. Marcion abridged Luke, AD 144, gets excommunicated from Rome, gets his money returned to him, all that stuff. By Bishop Pius I, by the way. He was the one that excommunicated Marcion 144 AD. Anyway, so here's the deal. That means the recognitions came from sometime between 142 to 156. Given, I haven't really made up my mind fully if the recognitions even knows about, like, if it's even a response to Marcion. It's definitely super negative against the Book of Acts. I can tell the author of recognitions hates Acts of a passion, hates Paul. And I think it was written because it didn't like that the church was being so positive about Paul. And so he wanted to remind people by integrating the Epistle of Zacchaeus, and looks like it's making Paul and Synoptic out to be allies. To be fair, Zacchaeus seems to be implying that too, but that's even more clear in the recognitions. But text wants everybody to remember we need to hate Paul. He attacked James, brother of Jesus. What are you doing? This guy doesn't deserve any authority. Paul's a bad dude. This is a sharp contrast from Clement of Rome in the 8090s, the Bishop of Rome. The original Clement treated Paul positively. At first Clement, yet he may still be connected to the situation. There is evidence of that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Earliest attestation of the recognitions, Origen's Philokalia. Origen's Philokalia is from the 4th century. It's quoting material from Origen's lost writings. This is what he has to say. And Clement of Rome, in his argument with his father at Laodicea, has some comments on the question before us. The passage occurs in the Travels, which agree with the foregoing. Towards the end, he speaks with great force on the seeming results of nativity, book 10. Okay. Clement of Rome in his Travels. What could that be? I wonder which text talks about Clement traveling around so much. Ah, yes, it's the recognitions. Origen knew about the recognitions. Origen's writing in the 3rd century. Now, I should mention there are scholars that dispute that the Philokalia was really quoting real material from Origen, but I don't see the issue with it, honestly. Let's go to Eusebius. Eusebius tells us, and this is not disputed, this is clear. I think it's as clear in a different way as the Philokalia is. Here's what Eusebius has to say in church history. But it must be observed also that there is said to be a second epistle of Clement, but we do not know that this is recognized like the former, for we do not find that the ancients have made any use of it. And certain men have lately brought forward other wordy and lengthy writings under his name, containing dialogues of Peter and Appian. No mention has been made of these by the ancients. They do not even preserve the pure stamp of apostolic orthodoxy. The acknowledged writing of Clement is well known. We have spoken also the works of Ignatius and Polycarp. Well, that's the Clementine recognitions. I know that because Appian is mentioned in book 10 in the Clementine recognition. So yeah, Eusebius is talking about that. Yeah. And he's saying it's baloney, fake, not written by Clement of Rome. Well, I agree, but it was written by somebody else with the same name. I just showed y'all evidence of that earlier. There was another Clement, but he wasn't bishop, like the earlier one was. So there's an interesting situation between Papias and Second Clement's recognitions. Let's take a look at what they have in common. They both mention a Matthew, an Andrew, a John, a Peter, a Thomas, a James, and a Philip. Yeah. Papias in fragment 1 tells us that these are all people that wrote a bunch of logia, sayings text. This depends on how we interpret Matthew. And this, I mean to refer to in relation to the Hebrew gospel. You could look at this Matthew is actually mentioned before he mentions Mark, but he mentions a bunch of other people there, and he doesn't seem to be mentioning them in chronological order. He shifts mode when he talks about Mark and Hebrew Matthew later in his text. But in any case, especially because of the later church fathers and how obsessed they are with Matthew the Apostle being an author, I would say there's enough evidence and stress over the situation that there was an awareness that Matthew wrote something, but it's lost. What they're quoting is the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is completely overriding that lost text that we don't have access to, giving us a whole new text from the early 2nd century. Anyway, that's what I meant by that. Papias and Clement, 2nd Clement, they're both mentioning people with the same names, saying things. You see my point? And notice that this has not been connected before. The connection hasn't really been made. Usually when people look at these texts, they don't make a connection between Papias and recognitions. I say we need to. I think the recognitions clearly knows about Papias. And he's presenting a counter narrative. The irony of it is we have pseudo-Clement's writings practically in their entirety. Well preserved. Really well preserved. But Papias, all we get is fragments. The church fathers don't really dislike Papias unless you read Eusebius. Eusebius can't stand Papias. Everybody else seems to not mind him. But pseudo-Clement, the church fathers can't stand that. I just gave you all an example. Eusebius says it's fake. And yet, the irony of the situation, the pseudo-Clementine literature survives. Big time. Whereas with Papias, all we get is fragments. Kind of funny if you think about it. Clement's recognitions gives us sayings of all of these people that Papias, would have given us if his writings had survived in full. They don't. We just get fragments, as I've said several times. I think there's a connection here. I think that one of two things is going on. Clement, 2nd Clement, I need to call him 2nd Clement. 2nd Clement, the true author of the recognitions, is giving us sayings of these people as a counter narrative to whatever Papias was telling us about what these people said. Rather, it's exactly the same quotations, and he's using them in different contexts, or if he's changing what they said, can't tell. We don't have what Papias said about these people. That's gone. So it's going to be very difficult to compare how Papias treats them to how 2nd Clement treats them. Let's go to the next slide. The Caracalla dating of recognitions refuted. Oh, I can't stand this. Just so it's on the record. I respect the scholar's opinion that came to this conclusion. But I think they are really wrong about it. That's the most respectful way that I can put it, okay? Because I think this is ridiculous. What am I talking about? In the early 3rd century AD, Emperor Caracalla gave a order to give everybody in the Roman Empire blanket citizenship. Okay? Supposedly, the Clementine recognitions makes a reference to that situation. Just so we're clear, the entire recognitions never mentions Emperor Caracalla. What it does is it talks about citizen. It uses the word citizen at least 7 times. Well, 7 times exactly, actually. If the scholars that claim this are correct, the recognitions can be no earlier than the early 3rd century. Now, that works with Origen's knowledge of it, as indicated by the Philokalia. But when we read how the word citizen is used in the recognitions, it falls apart. Void says, notably, the letter does not mention the execution of James, so either he didn't exist or wasn't yet killed, nor does it say if either Peter or Paul were killed in Rome, which strongly suggests. By the way, first, Clement, Bishop of Rome, well, he says other people killed. He said other jealous believers or envy. Actually, let me correct myself. Envious people killed Paul. He doesn't say the Romans did it. Boy says that's a quote from Richard Carrier on 1 Clement. Dr. Carrier argues that first Clement is 80s, 60s. I don't buy that for 5 seconds. But anyway, I'm not going to waste time on that. Let's go back to Caracalla. Caracalla, as I said a moment ago, gives an order for blanket citizenship for everybody in the empire. Now, I don't have the quotations on the screen, but I'll read it to you. We're going to go through every single reference to the word citizen in the Clementine recognitions. Don't worry, we won't be here for long. Just 7 references. So we're just going to be reading a few sentences. And then we'll be done with that. Let's begin. Certain man standing in the most crowded place in the city made proclamation to the temple saying, "Hear me, O you citizens of Rome, the Son of God is now in the regions of Judea, promising eternal life to everyone who will hear him, but upon condition that he shall regulate his actions according to the will of him by whom he has been sent, even of God the Father." Okay, I don't see how that's evidence for Caracalla's error at all. Let's go to the next use of the word citizen. It is not even received as a while if your intemperance and lust did not oppose. It ought to have been a citizen and a native. Strange way of using the word citizen, and still not evidence of blanket citizenship being given throughout the empire. Let's go to reference number 3. You shall be blessed, for you have deemed an ambassador of the truth worthy of all honor. So the truth herself shall receive you, a wanderer and a stranger, and shall enroll you a citizen of her own city. And then there shall be a great joy to you, because imparting a small favor, you shall be written heir of eternal blessings. Does that sound like a blanket citizenship? Doesn't sound like that to me. Let's go to the 4th reference. We're already almost done here. Then he learned from the brethren who had been sent before that the citizens had received them not only hospitably, but with all kindness by reason of their love towards Peter. So much so that several were disappointed because there were no guests of them, for that all had made such preparations that even if many more had come, there would still have been a deficiency of guests for the hosts, not hosts for the guests. We just got 3 more references to look over, and we'll be done. Then Peter, incapable of deception and moved with compassion, began to say, "There is a certain young man among those who follow me for the sake of religion and sect, a Roman citizen, who told me that he had a father and twin brothers, of whom not one is left to him." Doesn't sound like blanket citizenship to me. Sounds like people are being distinguished from citizens. Sounds pre Emperor Caracalla to me. We just got this reference and one more. Let's see here. For our first birth descends through the fire of lust, and therefore by the divine appointment, the second birth is introduced by water, which may extinguish the nature of fire, that the soul enlightened by the heavenly spirit may cast away the fear of the first birth, provided, however, it so live for the time to come that it did not at all seek after any of the pleasures of this world, but be, as it were, a pilgrim and a stranger and a citizen of another city. One more. When he had said this, he turned to the crowds and thus began, this person whom you see, O men, in this poor garb, is a citizen of the city of Rome, descended of the stock of Caesar himself. His name is Faustinius. Faustinius. I didn't say that right. Faustinianus. That's how it's actually pronounced. Excuse me. Let me ask all of you this question. I just read all 7 occurrences of the word citizen. This is a 10-volume text, so it's not using citizen very much. I put myself on the screen for a moment. Does any of that sound like it knows about Emperor Caracalla giving blanket citizenship to everybody? Or is it distinguishing non-citizens from citizens? Y'all tell me. Is it giving everybody blanket citizenship, or is it distinguishing them from citizens? Which is it? Which is it? Anybody want to tell me? Does that sound like the text knows about Emperor Caracalla's order to give everyone under the sun citizenship in the empire? Anybody have a response to me? Aficionatai says no. That's right. It does not. It never uses the word citizen like that. Ever. So that doesn't make sense. There is one thing I should mention. Scholars make connections between the recognitions and claim that it's using the works of, or works attributed to Bardasian of Edessa. That's interesting because Bardasian of Edessa, he's living in the late 2nd century. I think maybe he's also still alive in the early 3rd century AD. I don't remember, but he's definitely a late 2nd century AD person. I'm not going to get into that tonight. I don't think it contradicts the dating of the text being in Bishop Pius I's reign. The other issue that we have to, of course, note again, Tyrannius Rufinus edited the text into its final form in the beginning of the 5th century AD, about 401 AD, actually. It's around that year that he did this, or at least by that year. So it's also possible he added things that wasn't there. Why? Because he says so. In a preface that he added to the text, he admits to adding and taking things out. So he's both adding and subtracting. That does complicate studies on the Clementine recognitions. Here is an interesting thing, though. It does not appear that anywhere in the recognitions that it ever calls Clement bishop. That's an interesting thing. In the homilies, it does. I'm not going to talk about the homilies tonight. That's a mess for another time. Let's go back to the slides. Dating recognitions. Well, I kind of already have. But let's go over it again. As I wrote here, given the composition of the Shepherd of Hermas being placed by the Moratorian fragment during the reign of Bishop Pius I, who reigned from 142 AD to 146 AD, I said 146. I meant to say 156. Let me correct that. That was a mistake. There we go. 142 to 156 AD. And since Hermas mentioned Clement and his traveling activities during that bishop's reign, oh, that's right. I forgot about that. I forgot to mention this. The Clement mentioned by the Shepherd of Hermas, he's doing traveling. He is. He's traveling around just like the person in the recognitions does. It says that in the Shepherd of Hermas. It does. He's doing what Bishop Clement didn't do. This guy's actually traveling all over the place. Just like the guy in the recognition says. If that doesn't show it's him that wrote the text, I don't know what will. Anyway, let's continue. This means that the Clementine recognitions in its original form prior to modification in the early 5th century AD by Tyrannius Rufinus was composed during that reign. So between 142 AD to 156 AD, we get the Clementine recognitions. The formation of recognitions. Based on the evidence I went over earlier, this is the conclusion I've drawn. The epistles of Zacchaeus and Peter, composed in around AD 36-37, really wouldn't surprise me if it's entirely 36 AD, given that's when the attack on James happened. But anyway, Clement preserves the material. That's Bishop Clement in AD 96. That's how he's connected to the situation. Given that there's Clements that are related to him, like Clement II of Rome in the mid-2nd century that we've been talking about throughout the show, Clement of Alexandria, Titus Fabius Clemens of Alexandria. These people appear to be related. So that does imply a second Clement is borrowing from preserved material from Clement. He's obviously using first Clement. That's genuine to Clement of Rome, Bishop Clement of Rome. So Clement's the middleman, Clement I, preserving material from the 30s AD. Second Clement uses that information to create a historical fiction based on those texts. He called it the Recognitions of Clement, referred to by others as the Travels of Clement in the mid-2nd century. This is not a 3rd century work. This is not a 4th century work. This is much less a 5th century work. This is a mid-2nd century work by the second Clement of Rome. It is correct to call them pseudo-Clementine. I did mention in my previous appearances on podcasts and previous discussions on this channel that I was considering the recognitions being strongly connected to Clement of Rome. I didn't really know how to deal with it. But I thought the arguments for the late dating of it was so atrocious, it made me wonder if Clement of Rome was actually responsible for it. After looking at the evidence more closely and the Shepherd of Hermas, I realized that there's a whole new argument to be made about dating it to the mid-2nd century without claiming it's authentic. And without abandoning that James was killed in the late AD 30s. Because it's giving us the source material. It's telling us that the attack on James came from the epistle of Zacchaeus. I showed that earlier. You do not have to believe that the Recognitions is 1st century to accept that. The Recognitions can be historical fiction in the mid-2nd century without saying that Clement wrote it, but another man called Clement did. That's why I not only mentioned in the title of the video, abandoning the priority of the Hebrew gospel, but I also put in rethinking Clement's recognitions. To be fair to myself, I don't believe I said that I was certain about the early dating of the recognitions. I did admit that more work had to be done. And I also admitted the complications of Tyrannius Rufinus being an editor of it in the early 5th century AD. Late 4th century AD, early 5th century AD. My final appraisal of the text, my more definitive conclusion. It is a mid-2nd century historical fiction, writing in the genre of Greco-Roman travel logs, making use of preserved material from Clement, Bishop Clement of Rome, because Clement of Rome preserved material from Zacchaeus and Peter. Those epistles were integrated into a larger historical fictional framework. That's what happened. This supports the arguments from scholars that argue that the Clementine recognitions preserves material going back to preachings of Peter? Well, it sort of does, because the preachings of Peter are epistles. The recognitions clearly indicates that it's using material from letters of Peter and letters of Zacchaeus. I Fish in a Tie asks if Jesus is crucified in 30 or 33. By the way, I think 32 AD, but anyway. And James is killed in 36. How could James get so famous in only 3 to 6 years? Well, Jesus preached, well, depending on the gospel you read, a year or a couple of years. He got famous, obviously. We're talking about him today. 2,000 years of history. So, if Jesus can get famous from a short ministry, I think James can get famous too. I don't think there's any problem with that. Regardless, the texts are the text. There's a problem. Abdias in the 1st century says James was killed in the late 30s. How is he the same person mentioned by Josephus? Did he die twice? It's almost like, let me give you an example. It's like, what if I accept the apologetic claim? You know, a lot of you know about Judas and Matthew and Acts, right? Luke, who wrote Acts, contradicts Matthew about how Judas died. Okay. Matthew talks about Judas hanging himself in guilt for what he had done. In the book of Acts, Luke's second major work, Luke says that Judas's guts exploded everywhere, which is to me an imitation of the gruesome death of Herod Agrippa I. He died from worms in his gut, according to Josephus. So Acts doesn't like the way Matthew has Judas dying. Oh, him hanging himself? That's not entertaining. I want to write, but he exploded. So Luke wanted to give Judas a gruesome, more exciting, more disgusting death, because he was not satisfied with Matthew saying, oh, well, he just killed himself. He hanged himself. No, to Luke, that's not good enough. He needs to blow up. That's what he wants. That's more satisfactory, according to Luke. So that's what he wrote. Luke blew up everywhere. Suddenly. And then Papias gives a more disgusting treatment of Acts, Acts' version of Luke's death. Papias elaborates and says that Judas grew so big he couldn't pass where chariots did. Aficionatai asks, I know you answered this, but do you think James, the brother of Jesus, died in 36 or 62? 36. I think the one that died later is, I think, the same person that's mentioned in the Apocalypse of James. In the first Apocalypse of James, James is the brother of Jesus by title. It actually says that. He's not my brother by blood, but spiritually. If you read the beginning of the first Apocalypse of James, I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically what it says. In the second Apocalypse of James, Theuda, some person called Theuda, is identified as his father. Mark Madison made a comparison between the James that dies there and the James that dies in Josephus. Although he doesn't come to the same conclusions I do about who's really his brother, who's the brother of Jesus, who's not, and about James dying earlier, he does not come to the same conclusions about that I do. I actually think that's even more evidence that the James in Josephus is not the same person as the James in the Clementine literature, the historical James, the brother of Jesus. That James in Josephus was the brother of Jesus by title. So I think whatever claiming that somebody interpolated it later, I don't think it's an interpolation. I don't believe in destroying evidence to fit my theory. I think that I think the recognition of, I think Josephus himself was confused. I think he got confused. He mistakenly referred to James, the son of Theuda, who was understood in title only as brother of Jesus. But, well, I don't think he was totally confused. I think he was aware that there might be something wrong. He said that James is the brother of Jesus called Christ, legomeno Christo, called Christ. I find it interesting he puts it that way. Now, you could just simply say, well, he's just doubting if Jesus was the Christ. Excuse me, I should say is, because he does say was in the testimonium, past tense. So he doesn't accept Jesus is the Christ in the present tense like a Christian would. So that's another reason why I don't think the testimonium was interpolated. But anyway, in the James passage, he says that James is called. I'm sorry, James's brother, Jesus, is called the Christ. So I think that Josephus could be giving an indication there that he's doubting if James really is the brother of Jesus called the Christ. So I don't think he's just questioning if Jesus is the Christ, but I also think that he's questioning. He's giving a little clue there that he could be questioning if James is even the brother of that particular person. That's another reason why I don't think it's an interpolation. Even if he didn't use the word legomino there, I would still say it's authentic. I don't have a problem with it. But the fact that he uses it just makes it be even more Josephine. So it's a good thing he used it. But I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, here we go. I fish in a tie. Thank you for your super chat. Just started researching this Abdius. Whoa, exciting. Yeah, we should talk about that more. I think even also privately too, because I think there's a lot that needs to be done there. I've been trying to give Abdius attention for the last couple of years, and people are just not giving this guy any attention. He needs to get some attention. Trying to make that happen. At least I succeeded a little bit tonight, and a little bit back then. But anyway, yeah, I think that if you put the James passage together with the apocalypses of James, you have a James that gets killed in AD 62. By the way, I didn't finish my point about Mark Madison earlier. He was noting the parallel between the James and the apocalypses and the James and Josephus because they were both killed by stoning. You see? So James, the son of Judah, was killed by stoning, just like the James of Josephus was. And the James in the first and second apocalypses of James is not the blood brother of Jesus. He's not. This is a complete contrast from Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus in his letter, quoted by the Recognitions in the mid-2nd century, Zacchaeus in the AD 30s, AD 36, is telling us that James is the brother of Jesus. He does not say it spiritually. The apocalypse is saying it's spiritual because it's trying to tell you it's a different James. It's not the same one that died earlier in the 1st century. Fisher-Tai says he is associated with Simon, Jude, Thomas, and Thaddeus. Those are relatives of Jesus. Yeah, we could talk about that more another time. I should really get back to the presentation. I'm almost done. Oh, actually, that was the last slide. Okay, then I'll go ahead and close it. I put myself back on the screen. Yeah, I needed to straighten this out before I finished getting my papers out for the Journal of Higher Criticism. I needed to straighten out my thoughts on the Hebrew gospel because I was questioning that since late last year. Also had some questions about it even earlier, but it became more concerning to me toward the end of last year. And I realized the gospel of the Hebrews being talked about by the church fathers and Papias is not the original logia of Matthew, which is totally lost. That's unfortunate, but that's just reality. The good news is that the Recognitions admits that it gets its information about the attack on James, which, quite frankly, that James bit in the Recognitions, in both debates and in discussions, I just used that portion from the Recognitions for the most part. I didn't really depend on anything else in it, not really. It's just that passage and a few other passages, and that was it. And same with the Hebrew gospel. All I really used from it was a bit about Jesus appearing to James. And I used it as evidence because he's identified as a brother of the Lord. That's it. So the historical anchor of making him of the text making him James, the brother of Jesus. But since the recognition is quoting Zacchaeus, and since Papias is clearly saying the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is using Mark as a source, well, that's impossible. The Hebrew Gospel can't be first century. It's second century, and with the recognitions being mid second century, well, that's not a big deal because it's simply quoting a text from the first century and integrating it into historical fiction. So the fuller texts don't need to be earlier. They're later, but the overall structure of my argument is unaltered, uh, and um, and this changes nothing about what I said about Paul at all. The original Paul being in the 80 30s, Solus being in the 60s, being killed by Emperor Nero. Uh, that person, that Solus, is talked about by Josephus. That's the basis for the later mythical story of Paul's execution under Nero. That's not historical. It was plagiarized from Josephus from another person called Solus. Solus was confused with Paul deliberately by later Christians. And even in the epistles of Paul, there's information about him that's integrated there in Second Corinthians and Romans 16, especially about the business about him being related to somebody called Herodian. Uh, and that has to do with the Herodian family. Uh, Paul's flight from King Aretas in Second Corinthians is also connected, but not totally. That's a complicated situation for another time. Not too complicated though. I don't want to get into that tonight too much. And then you have Sola Guscala, the actual author of Paul's epistles in the 80 90s. Um, yeah, that argument that I've been making about Paul, uh, totally unaffected by tonight's analysis on the Clementine recognitions, tonight's presentation on it. Um, so, Richard Fellows is asking me a question. Are you really saying that both Acts and Galatians are wrong about James? Well, I think Galatians is trying to, um, I think Galatians is taking the attack on James, the brother of the Lord, the brother of Jesus, and is turning it into a theological argument. So I think Galatians is trying to sanitize, like, oh no, we can't have Paul attack James. Let's turn it into an argument, not because Paul wanted him dead. Because in the recognitions there is no argument. Paul just goes after the guy, lunges after him, wants him dead. And then somebody else, according to Papias, finished him off with a Fuller's Club, brained him. That's not an argument. That's murder. But in Galatians, it's just an argument. But I also think that they're backdating the argument in the Epistle of James, because the Epistle of James is arguing with the person writing Paul's letters in the 90s, um, and backdating the situation, retrojecting that onto the James that was killed in 36 AD. That's what's going on. And some people try to question, oh well, my argument about Saulus being conflated with Paul is ridiculous. No, it's not. Compare the Acts of Paul in the late second century to Josephus and tell me that I'm wrong with a straight face. Does the Acts of Paul not claim that Paul was killed by Emperor Nero? Where did they get that from? It contradicts First Clement. First Clement says envious men killed Paul when he was farthest west of the empire. That's Spain or Hispania. Where did the Acts of Paul get that information from? Where did he get it from? Well, it gets it from Josephus, because Solus, the Herodian, and his brother Castabras, a fellow Herodian, they appear before Emperor Nero, and that is it. Josephus has nothing more to say about them. He talks about this in his Wars of the Jews. Is that a coincidence that he just happened to have a Solus? That's Saul, somebody called Saul, and his brother Castabras appearing before Emperor Nero. And more than 100 years later, about 100 years later, somebody else decides to write a text about Paul's martyrdom under Emperor Nero when nobody else said anything about it. That's a conflation. They took a story of what happened to someone else with a similar name and confused that person with Paul. The real Paul did not die that way. First Clement tells you how Paul dies, killed by envious men. I recommend the work of Oscar Coleman on that. He goes over First Clement, and I think he's right. That First Clement clearly indicates that envious men killed Paul. And I think this would place Paul's death in about AD 39. Richard Fellows asks me, when do you date Paul's visit to Jerusalem in Galatians 2? It's after 14 years and mentions James. I think Galatians is plagiarizing Josephus. I'll tell you why. So Galatians, it talks about Barnabas, and then 3 years later, excuse me, I can't remember exactly how it puts it, but it talks about going to Jerusalem. I think it's 3 years later, and then 14 years later, he goes back there. So I thought that's interesting because the 14 years is connected to a vision that Paul supposedly had in Second Corinthians. Paul's vision is, I believe it's mentioned in Galatians. Some argue it's the same 14 years. Others argue it's not. Seems like it's the same to me. Let me just explain why I think it's plagiarizing Josephus. Let me give my argument for that. Josephus, in his autobiography, his life, his vita, he says he spent 3 years with a man called Bannus. He was taught in the ways of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. He chose to be a Pharisee at the end of his tutelage by Bannus. This was from the year 53 to 56 AD. Josephus tells us that in his life. Well, what's interesting is if you go 14 years later, from 56 to 70, Josephus goes to Jerusalem with Commander Titus. In Galatians, Paul, or so-called Paul, says after 14 years, he went to Jerusalem and took Titus along with him. I think this story is imitating what Josephus had done. Josephus is alive. So I don't think Galatians is very good information. I know you will disagree with me about Galatians using Josephus. You believe that the historical Paul actually wrote it. I don't. I think Sulla Viscala, somebody pretending to be Paul, is writing these texts. I don't think the original Paul wrote Galatians. But I think he intended it to be read that way. He wanted people to think that 14 years is part of Paul's life. He visited Jerusalem twice. I think that's what he wanted people to believe. But I don't think it's true. I don't think it's actually true. I think these epistles were written by 97 AD. Maybe some of them in 96, maybe 95. The more I think about it, I wouldn't be surprised that all of them are written in 97. So I put it in late 90s. And I think you worked with Silas, you worked with Timothy, Tertius, and Sophanes. They were co-authors. The other issue I have with the authenticity, the so-called authenticity of any of these letters, is actually First Clement. First Clement never mentions these 13 letters. Some claim it's quoting letters. Some claim that First Clement knew First Corinthians because it mentions other parties in the church. Paul is in conflict with Cephas and Apollos, stuff like that. And it matches material you see in First Corinthians. There's only one problem. Clement never tells us the title of this epistle of Paul. It just says he's just mentioning a letter, one letter. That's all you can take from it. Clement doesn't indicate he knows a letter collection. He doesn't know 7, much less 13 Pauline epistles. He never says, but he knew epistles plural from Paul. He doesn't say that. Um, he just doesn't talk about it. I find it hard to believe that these epistles existed before First Clement. That Clement would be so ignorant. How could he be so ignorant? How does he know? How does he never mention Timothy, Silas, and Sophanes? I mean, Timothy is in Second Corinthians. Sophanes is in First Corinthians. How could Clement not know that those were fellow workers of Paul? How does he miss that? These are issues that I've been given responses to them in the past, but they're not really satisfactory to me. It's hard. It's hard to argue against it because Clement just doesn't talk about that stuff. So the only way you could try to defend it is to say, well, Clement just didn't care about that stuff. Well, you have to show me why you wouldn't. Good luck with that. Give it your best chance. Give it your best shot. But really, the fact he doesn't talk about that stuff, he can't even be bothered to tell you the title of Paul's letter. Clement's writing to the Corinthians. He's trying to use Paul as an example, as a hero, as a good man. He doesn't even mention the title of the letter. I would think he would, since Clement's writing to the Corinthians. He would mention Paul's letter to the Corinthians. No, he doesn't even do that. He doesn't seem to. Richard Fellows says Clement mentions Fortunatus, who appears in First Corinthians. Did he mention that Fortunatus came from that letter? Because if he doesn't, he got that knowledge about Fortunatus in another way. I must presume that. And even if it came from that unnamed, untitled letter of Paul, okay. But based on what Clement's saying, it sounds like it's a lot shorter than the one we have. And I don't even know who Paul was writing that to. Without Clement telling me the title of it, I'm not going to assume the title of it. It happens to have material that parallels First Corinthians. Great. That doesn't mean it has everything that's in First Corinthians. So I do accept that Paul wrote something before 70 AD. I just don't think he wrote anywhere near as much as it's commonly believed today. A lot of people believe that Paul wrote 7 letters. Okay, I don't. I think he wrote something, but it was small. Let's take a look at how First Clement mentions Fortunatus. Now send ye back speedily unto us our messengers Claudius Ephabus and Valerius Bito, together with Fortunatus also in peace and with joy, to the end that they may the more quickly report the peace and concord which is prayed for and earnestly desired by us, that we also may the more speedily rejoice over your good order. That's toward the end. That's right, one verse before the end of First Clement. I haven't paid too much attention to that, Fortunatus. To me, from my brief glance at it, I'm gonna look at it more closely. I don't think that helps anything about the standard view. Is Fortunatus, I'm not making definitive statements, I'm just gonna ask some questions. Is Fortunatus alive in the AD 90s? What's he doing being alive in the AD 90s? I find that strange. I find that very strange. How do I know that First Corinthians isn't plagiarizing First Clement and getting Fortunatus from it? He's not saying he got that from Paul's letter. How do I know the dependence is in the reverse? Not making definitive statements, just asking questions. And on that note, I'll leave everybody with that. I want to thank everybody for watching tonight. And I'll see everybody later. Good night, everybody. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.